Okay, hi everyone. So this set of notes is going to cover Paul Laurence Dunbar. We're going to be reading a good deal of his poems for this week, and I have lots of extra resources up on our Canvas site here. I'll bring one of them up so you can have the Poetry Foundation's always a really good reference, and this is Paul Laurence Dunbar. So you might have heard of his name before, I'm not sure, but in terms of us progressing in our timeline of African American literature, it is really important that we cover, as you can see here, he's born in the later part of the 1870s, and it is really important part to cover. He's an extremely influential poet, novelist, and playwright, especially during this time period. So he's born in Ohio. His parents had been enslaved in Kentucky before the Civil War, and he started writing stories and poems when he was still a little kid. He was able to go to school. He was the president of his high school's literary association. And by the age of 16 is when a lot of his work starts to get actually published. So I'll scroll down here a little bit more. This is where we're taking a lot of our poems by Paul Laurence Dunbar for this week too. So we want to definitely kind of look and see how we want to approach our annotations. We're going to be reading James Weldon Johnson next week, just kind of going a little backwards in some of the pieces here to preface some of the just last couple writers we're going to look at for the remainder of our couple weeks that we have in the semester. So a lot of his more popular work in his lifetime was written in a lot of that Negro dialect, or what we've been reading here, in some of the vernacular that we've been reading throughout the entire semester. So you might see some of that in the pieces that you're reading and the pieces that you're looking at too, in terms of some of the language used, and in terms of some of the conversation that's in there as well. He obviously also wrote in conventional English for other poetry and novels, and a lot of scholars have really took, I think, a great leaning towards really dissecting some of his works over the years as well. So, interestingly enough, too, he actually wrote the lyrics for a musical comedy, which is called Indahominy, which was very early, like 1903, and it was the first all African American musical produced on Broadway. And later on, it went down to be produced throughout the whole United States, and then even in the United Kingdom as well, which was pretty cool. So you can see here, aside from his life point, that he obviously showed a lot of promise from when he was a young kid. Even before he graduated, he had been, I always think this is such a cool fact that he had already published poems in the Dayton Herald and worked as an editor of a black newspaper, the Dayton Tatler, who was actually published by his classmate, who was Orville White, who of course we know with his brother would be the inventors of the airplane after that. And even though he sought a law career, he couldn't, make that means absolutely possible because of his family's financial situation. So I think it's really interesting how he turned to writing and turned to poetry a lot in specific, to getting his message across. We are reading some of these for this week too. Sympathy is, of course, one of his most popular poems. Ode to Ethiopia. We Wear the Mask is another really, really popular one as well. So we're going to be looking at those pieces. And far as his literary style, it's known for a lot of like colorful language, I think very accessible conversational tone, lots of different structures. Specifically his use of dialect, even though most of his pieces are written in conventional English, you do have some pieces that are using the African American dialect, and in terms of also reflecting kind of like the region of the area that he's focusing on too. Um, he felt there was something kind of suspect about, marketing dialect poems because, he very much said like, this is sort of the natural speech. I don't think, we should be marketing them in that kind of sort of way too. So that's something also to consider and to really think about as well. But he really became the first African American poet to earn national distinction, which is also very important in terms of looking at sort of the literary landscape here. As you can see as well here, going through in terms of his education and his friends really trying to pursue him and really rely on them for the means to kind of keep going. So I think that's also something, these different poems in a variety of themes and styles. I consider them some of the very best done, particularly to be able to write in such a wide range of styles, I think is really unique and important too. So you can see here when he did some traveling, kind of gone back and forth, spent some time abroad, and he came back, and he already in 1897 obtained a clerkship at the Library of Congress. That's where he married, who we're going to be getting into, Alice Ruthmore. He died very, very young. He died at the age of 33 from tuberculosis because at that point there was no cure for that at all. So he did not live a long life at all. You can see here his novel, his first novel is called The Uncalled, and that looks at Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter and probing the spiritual predicament of a minister. So it didn't get a lot of accolades or a lot of praise. It was very much rejected at first as well, kind of opposite of, Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. And by the end of almost the turn of the century here, with his health still deteriorating, he leaves the Library of Congress, goes on another reading tour, publishes his poetry is very, very well received. But at the same time, his his health is really, really failing here. So he goes and travels a little bit across the country, and you can see in his final years here, his second novel, again dismissed. So they aren't quite well received or anything like that. While some of his poetry is much, much better received as well. In the Old Plantation Days is 25 stories set on the Southern plantation during the times of slavery. These short story collections very much earned him a lot of praise and sort of praiseworthy and publishedness that kind of came along with that too. And even though he continued to write and publish, you can see here his health declined. He relied on alcohol to help his coughing, and he ends up passing away in 1906. So really, really young age that he ends up passing away, which is, again, very sad to think all that he could have even accomplished more had he lived a little bit longer. So lots of other legacies and honors you can, of course, I've linked on here as well. And you can look at sort of the National Park Service and going back in Dayton, his residence, his home there was preserved as the Paul Laurence Dunbar House. You can still see his house in Washington, D.C. that he lived. You've got numerous schools, obviously, across the country that have been named after him, that have been, set aside, and he's been obviously a major influence in African American literature. So I'm really excited to approach some of these poems with you this week. I'll head over to our modules tab here, and if I scroll down, I can't believe how far I have to scroll down now. We're looking at several different poems for this week too to annotate. The four that I've collected here: We Wear the Mask, The Haunted Oak, Sympathy, and very last one that, I have to go on another page here, Ode to Ethiopia. The Poetry Foundation did not have this one, are probably some of his more famous poems. And I also linked to, you can pick one of the other ones or annotate more for extra credit if you really want to. But there's a lot of themes and areas I think you can consider and think about when you're reading both his poetry or any of his short prose as well. I think a lot of this double consciousness in terms of identity is really important to look at. I think you can look at how he sort of revises the idea of the white plantation literature and some of these minstrelly traditions. I think you can definitely look at these pledges of faith and romantic love on all context. You really want to look at his humor and use of pathos in his pieces. Obviously, of course, the vernacular and these very classic lyric forms that he's using for some of his poetry. And these includes things like ballads and folk songs and other kind of sonnets and lyric forms, because I think those are really important to understanding not only his major poems. Obviously, his major poems outnumber those actually written in dialect, but that still doesn't take anything away from them, because they're some of his equally best pieces as well too. So, in looking at, I think, him as a poet and sort of as a crusader in this time period as well, given what he had in his short time that he was with us. I think, especially if you consider the last 10 years of his life, he wrote so much and he was turning out poetry and stories and novels and lyrics. And so he really, really influenced what's going to come pretty shortly after him, which is the writers of the Harlem Renaissance. So I'm very interested to see how you all react and kind of what you take away from his poetry too, because I really, really hope that you enjoy the pieces and that we can kind of make some of these connections together to some of the other authors and the future authors to come.